that you know, Julian Assange may be a free man in a few hours. Very, very mixed emotions, right? Like I said to a couple people, I'm so happy I might cry, but I'm also still so angry about all this, I might put a hole in the wall. Yeah, mixed emotions today, but overall, just so happy for Julian, for the relief his family are must be experiencing right now, being reunited with his with Stella, with their children, with his father, mother, brother, so forth. But Yeah, it's quite something. It's quite something, and shocking. I actually was supposed to go back to London in a couple of weeks to help with the appeal hearing. And so we were communicating about that in terms of plans for that. And didn't hear anything yesterday, and I was supposed to. And then 7 o'clock, 7:30 or so my time, I got an email from somebody. And then sure enough, so very happy to see it. As I said this to someone else, I've never been so happy to have a trip canceled to some place like London before, So yeah, so it's a wonderful day, though we are not out of this by any means. This certainly isn't an end at all to the government's assault on free speech or a free press. I think the American government views this as the best opportunity we're going to get, and I think they can see it as a win. They've got a conviction on a plea deal, which I guess maybe isn't the legal precedent they wanted, but they certainly also didn't lose in court. They didn't lose in the British courts. They didn't lose in the American courts. This isn't going to be a campaign issue for the Biden campaign. So, and as far as they're concerned, they're free to carry forward with it. It's open to them to go on. Their thesis was not proved incorrect. They were not told to stand down by an American court. So they, as far as they're concerned, they can still continue to go after journalists anywhere in the world who displease them. So while today is a day to celebrate and to be so happy for Julian and Stella and their family, it's also a day that we have to keep in mind that this is not over at all, and that we are still in this fight against an empire that will do everything it can, anything it wants to suppress speech, journalism, whatever it is that offends it.
So amazing, Matt, to hear that. In your opinion, the way that the United States managed to do that, what was the message that the government, that the United States was trying to send by this type of act, in your opinion?
I think we've seen these last, Julian went into the Ecuadorian embassy to the protective custody of the embassy, basically, more than 12 years ago. It was June of 2012, early June, I believe. And so for 12 years, essentially, the US government, as my friend Misty Winston describes it, has had Julian's head on a pike as a warning to others, right? So this idea that if you expose our crimes, if you embarrass us, if you do anything that is not in line with our narrative, so if you're not a well-behaved journalist who is going to go along and get along with us, this will be the consequence. And so you had 12 years of captivity that Julian and his family had to endure without any type of judicial decision, right? Without any form of due process, except for what he has experienced the last few years during these extradition hearings in British court, which have not gone to the facts of the case. It's been procedural. It's been, it has not been about whether or not what he did composed an actual crime or not. It's all been procedural. So 12 years of his life was taken from him quite brutally. And certainly the torture he has endured, and let's be clear, because that's what experts have described it as torture, has been so impactful. The diminishment of his mind, body, soul during this process. Like I was in the embassy. I met him in 2014 in Ecuadorian embassy. It's basically a 3-bedroom apartment. And at that point, 2.5 years into his time there, my thoughts were, my God, 2.5 years in here? And I mean, that was in November of 2014. And so now today in June of 2024, he's finally maybe a free man in a few hours. We're taping this now, and it's several hours away from Julian appearing in front of the judge in Saipan. So hopefully all goes well, and he's a free man and on his way back home to Australia. In several hours. But certainly this idea of him being that head on a pike, a warning to others. It was something that was a clear part, was a very real aspect of what the American government was doing here. It was trying to dissuade journalism. It was trying to punish and prevent truth telling. And it's still alive. It's still an open possibility. As I just said, nothing has been determined. No court said, no, the American government was wrong, particularly an American court, which is what you're really going to need. I think maybe the Biden administration was afraid of that, afraid that in this case, getting him into an American court would not just prove embarrassing and be inconvenient and uncomfortable, but that possibly they could lose. I think, certainly the idea that they could lose in the British court, that the Brits could deny his extradition was something that was very real, particularly coming off of the hearing in May, where it was quite clear that this is a First Amendment issue, a free speech issue, and that Julian's denial of his right to free speech was so apparent that the British system, the British courts had a decision to make, either kowtow and embarrass themselves, humiliate themselves in their supplication and their slavish obeyance of the Americans, or do what is very clearly the right thing here and prevent extradition. And so I think that the Americans, the White House, the Department of Justice, they understood this. They understood that there was no certainty in a win. And I think also as well, I think the White House, the Biden campaign was concerned about this potentially being an election issue. They knew that this was not something that they could campaign on. They knew that very likely, you've already seen RFK Jr., Jill Stein, Chase Oliver, Cornel West are all behind freedom for Julian Assange, all behind a free press. Donald Trump, of course, would take this issue and make it his, even if he was never going to do anything to help Julian, even though he will do everything to demolish a free press. For the campaign, it would be very difficult, though, for the Biden administration. So I think there's a number of things you look at and say, okay, why did the Biden administration do this? Why did they go in for a deal with Julian and his team? It's understandable why they did it, particularly when they do have, and I know it's a plea deal, so it's not the same thing. It doesn't set the precedent as an actual conviction in a court would, but it is a conviction under the Espionage Act against a publisher, against a journalist. It is a good first step in getting control of the overall information space, the overall journalistic space, the overall media space that has been created in the last couple of decades because of the internet. This is something you and I talk about a lot, right? The possibilities that have been made available to people to understand the world, to be informed, to cooperate, to coordinate, to mobilize, to educate, so on and so forth, because of this technology. Julian was a trailblazer in this. When they start WikiLeaks more than 15 years ago, that's the idea about using this type of technology to localize the spread of information, to decentralize the spread of information, to give people access to information as it exists in its raw, unedited, unfiltered form. And that, of course, has, where that has gone in the last 15 years, we've seen, with these things, right? And with TikTok, right? And this is why several months ago, you had the American Congress voting to ban TikTok because it's a threat. The spread of this kind of information through uncontrolled sources is a threat. And so this attack on Julian, this persecution of Julian is the first step, and I think what will be many that we're going to see going forward of attempts by the American government, the American empire, to get control of the information space. You know, I mean, they've been going after Julian for essentially more than 12 years now. During that time, you have seen the assaults on the Fourth Amendment here in the U.S., the assaults on privacy as revealed by, say, Ed Snowden and other whistleblowers. You've also seen the bringing of the technology giants, right? The internet companies into the circle of the elites that make up those in power. So what they've done is they've brought in the Googles, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, etc., into their circle of elites, so that's how they, just as with the corporate media, traditional mainstream media, how they are members of the elite. You now have the internet companies, the major internet companies, part of that is elite as well, so they can be counted upon to lock arms and do the right thing. And you know what Julian and WikiLeaks started 15 years ago, what we see best through now in TikTok, that is such a great threat to the elite. It's such a great threat to the establishment. It's such a great threat to the empire that we have to understand that Julian walking out as a free man today is not an end to anything. But only just one of the first of many, many chapters in this ongoing battle that we're going to have with the American empire for our rights of both speech and privacy.
Yeah, Matt, what would it mean for Snowden that he is in some sort of prison as long as he's not allowed to live in his own country?
Right.
And
Yeah, you know, I'm sure Ed is incredibly happy for Julian and his family, but of course, Ed Snowden is in exile in Russia. He doesn't want to be there. You know, his wife and children are there. They've become Russian citizens because that's what they've had to do. You can only live in a country for so long before you become a citizen. I mean, that's just essentially what happened with Ed Snowden and his family. And you know, one of the things I always speak about Ed Snowden about is this man is a patriot. People know, and it shows you how powerful the government propaganda is, and how complicit the corporate media is in providing that propaganda as the narrative telling of reality, right? And so everyone go back, was 11 years or so. I think Ed's revelations were in 2013. Everyone knew within a month or two that Ed's girlfriend, now his wife, the mother of his kids, had been a stripper or something like that, right? Everyone knew that. Almost nobody knew that the reason why Ed ended up in the intelligence community, why he had a high security clearance, a top secret clearance, was because he was training to become a Green Beret in the American Army, broke his leg, had some type of accident, had to be medically discharged, but at that point had received a security clearance that allowed him then to move over into the American intelligence community. Almost nobody knows that, right? Almost nobody knows the story about Ed Snowden, who had almost become a Green Beret, right? Had almost become American Special Forces soldier. You know, so you know, it just shows you the power of storytelling, the power of information control, and how complicit, how again how the arms are locked together of you know, the media, of the corporations, and of the government. And that was what Ed was essentially detailing when he came forward and revealed what he revealed in terms of how we are all living in a mass surveillance state, that the American government is spying on all of us in ways that George Orwell couldn't even contemplate, and that it can only be done with the direct involvement of American corporations, that the American technology companies, the American media companies, the American communications companies, telecommunications companies, all were locked arm in arm with the American government in this surveillance, in this spying of the American people, let alone, of course, people all around the world, including heads of states of key American allies like Angela Merkel, right? But I mean, so, Ed Snowden looking at this, I'm sure he is quite happy for Julian. And I think this idea of maybe possibly in the future, we would have a president who would rescind the threats against Ed and allow him to come back to the U.S. I just don't see that happening anytime soon, even if we have a Trump presidency, because I don't trust Trump at all, and I believe that his national security people would argue against that. But certainly, this idea of getting Ed home, just as Julian is able to go home, is something that we all need to continue to work for. And just in the same as Julian being released or hopefully being released in a matter of hours, the next stage, of course, is to seek a pardon for Julian. So just as ending the persecution, the threats against Ed Snowden, we now must seek a pardon for Julian Assange, as well as continue to combat this combined assault by the American government, by the American empire on in the U.S. our First and Fourth Amendment rights, as well as around the world on the right of free speech, of free press, and of privacy.
Yeah. Matt, shifting to the conflicts in Gaza and in Ukraine. Right now, we're witnessing that the United States, the government in the United States, is supporting two countries who are attacking civilians. And this is amazing when you see nothing coming out of the government talking about these crimes that are happening right now. How we can understand this type of behavior on the part of the Biden administration?
Well, I mean, the calculation for the Biden administration has purely been a self-interested political one. What is best for their reelection in November? That's what every conversation comes back to. The calculation made by the Biden administration almost 9 months ago in the case of say Gaza, in case of the Palestinians, was that the continued support of the Israel lobby, particularly AIPAC, was of much greater consequence to them than the loss of 3, 4, 5 million votes among progressive Democratic voters. That the loss of, say, the Arab and Muslim community's support for Joe Biden's reelection campaign, as well as for all the down ballot Democratic races, is of less concern than losing AIPAC, than losing the Israel lobby. I think they have come to realize that that might not have been the most correct calculation. We see the power of that lobby, though. We see it now today. You have primary races in across the U.S., including in New York, where AIPAC has put last count I saw was $15 million. They had pledged up to $25 million. Perhaps it will be that much when all the accounting is done. But you've had AIPAC, the Israel lobby, go into a Democratic primary race, something they have done before many times, and most of the times they're successful, with an obscene amount of money in order to ensure that their primary candidate, whether it be a challenger or an incumbent, wins. And in this case, in New York, Jamal Bowman, who is a member of the squad, if you will, has been under this pressure from AIPAC, where again, at least 15 million, as many as maybe as much as $25 million being spent against him in a primary race. So you can understand the calculation that the White House made and what they were afraid of. Now, they have only themselves to blame for this. The Democrats have only themselves to blame because they have enabled this. They have gone along with this. For decades, they have gone along with the Israel lobby when the reality of what might happen to them was clear. And so now they are a party that, along with Republicans, are inviting the war criminal leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to address the American Congress. And just like the last time he addressed the American Congress was in 2015 or so, he will receive a standing ovation basically every minute he talks. and the Democrats will stand up and applaud, maybe not as often as the Republicans, but certainly it will be dozens and dozens of times. And the Democrats are the ones who have put themselves into that position. I don't want to take away from the agency of those members of Congress, because there are many American members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, who are not solely pro-Israel because of the lobby money. These are people who really do believe in Israel and believe in an Israel first policy, just as they really do believe in, say, American exceptionalism and the good and the benefit and the glory of the American empire. But certainly, you see what this type of calculation has brought. The fact that you have both American parties cheering on genocide in Gaza. And then, of course, what you've seen in Ukraine, it's by and large the same type of calculations. If you remember, go back almost a year ago, go back 10 months to beginning of September of last year, and Joe Biden's campaign releases his first campaign ad. And the first campaign ad for the Biden reelection team was of Joe Biden going to Ukraine, right? Trumpeting this idea of Joe Biden as a wartime commander in chief. The first, and then after, of course, October 7th, and Joe Biden went to Israel, it was reinforced. The first American president to go to 2 war zones. That type of that type of rhetoric, that type of triumphalism, that type of jingoism, if you will. And that was the bet. And so what you have in Ukraine, why does this administration, when they can clearly, how could they not understand that this war is unwinnable? Why do they continue to go along with it? And I think this explains why the Brits are doing this, and leaders of other European countries, because politically they feel that this is a better option than peace, that the politics of this war are more constructive for them, are of greater benefit than peace is. So in the White House's case, you have this calculation that for the last 9 years, essentially since 2015, you go back even farther, the Democratic Party has had a narrative, a political strategy of portraying themselves as being locked in an existential fight with not just the Republicans, but with Russia. So for the last almost decade, you've had this Russiagate narrative that has existed, that the Democrats believe has been successful. And they have intertwined Russia with the Republican Party. They have conjoined Vladimir Putin with Donald Trump. And to walk away from that now would be disastrous for them. This is what they believe they can win this election on. So even though, as they continue to escalate the war in Russia, in Ukraine, as they continue to escalate this war with Russia, as they continue to poke the bear, if you will, even though it's so clear what will happen, the consequences could be. They believe that losing the election, the risks of losing the election, are greater and more certain than the risks of nuclear war, and that they rather risk nuclear war than risk losing the election. So they will continue to push this war in Ukraine, and they will do everything that they feel they need to do to continue their narrative of Joe Biden and Democrats standing up against the Russians, Joe Biden and Democrats standing up for democracy against authoritarianism, right? So again, it's a calculation. It's a base political calculation that helps you understand why they are choosing to go along with this. There's ideological aspects of this. Certainly, there are those members of the Democratic Party, just are Republican members of the Democratic Party, again, like with Israel, who really do believe that the American empire is standing up to barbarians at the gate, that the American empire is necessary in Europe as it is around the world to preserve civilian order. There's all kinds of reasons why people support this, but when you get down to the reasons behind the White House decision making, I think this is what you see: this very cold political calculation that this is best for our reelection chances.
Yeah, Matt, when you look at this attack on Sevastopol, and Russia is saying that they're gonna respond, and we know that they're gonna respond, and we don't know how they're gonna respond. But at the end of the day, we know that they're not interested in killing civilians. They didn't show this all along these 2 years of conflict, more than 2 years of the conflict. But do you think they're thinking of escalation in terms of those groups who are fighting the United States in the region, in the Middle East? What they're thinking of, in your opinion, right now?
They've certainly made that warning. They've issued that warning. Just as say Hezbollah has issued the warning in the Middle East, the state of Cyprus, that will expand, that you want to be involved with this, and there'll be consequences. I think you have, which is interesting because that's also one of the places where people point to where the Russians could expand the war against, say, the British, is with the British military bases in Cyprus. I don't think you'll see the Russians expand the war outside of Ukraine, though. I think they are smart enough, mature enough, patient enough not to do that. They have the wisdom, which, as an American, is a terrible position to be in, right? To say, my God, we are depending upon another nation to have the wisdom, the intelligence, the maturity to do the right thing here, right? So we are so lost, we are so foolish, we are so reckless that we have abandoned any agency in this, and we are now depending upon another nation to ensure that we don't enter into World War III. I mean, giving up control like that, letting go of the wheel as it's occurring is horrifying. But the United States, this White House has put us into this position, and I don't want to leave out the other NATO countries because they've been, the British, the French, the Dutch, so forth, have been doing everything they can to make this nightmare continue to devolve and become a real possibility of apocalyptic nuclear war. But I mean, I don't think the Russians, though, getting back to it, I don't think the Russians will expand the war outside of Ukraine. I think they'll ratchet it up another level. Like you said, I don't believe they will target civilians either. But what we did see happen, say, in the last 6 months was an increased Russian targeting of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, to the point now that Ukraine essentially has half the power that it had 6 months ago. Right, which is causing real problems throughout all of Ukraine, as you can imagine. I think you'll see like that type of attacks on infrastructure. The Russians have not gone after bridges in the way that, say, the American military would have. We would have destroyed every bridge in Ukraine by now. That's our doctrine, and that's what we have done in all of our wars, our modern wars. So we would have destroyed the bridges. So maybe you'll see something like that where the Ukrainians go after bridges. I mean, it's possible you could see that the Russians go after maybe one of the American drones. They have pointed it out. The American drones in the Black Sea before. If you remember, about a year ago, a Russian jet knocked a American drone out of the sky over the Black Sea. The Russians in the last couple of days have pointed out the drones we have operating there. So maybe they're signaling that that's what they'll go after in an attempt to say, no more, stop it. I don't think that's going to work on the Americans. It's not going to work on the British or the French or whoever, NATO in general. Again, this calculation is that escalating the war is good politics. The risks of escalation don't match up to the risks of losing elections, which is what basically every government in NATO, at least the Western governments, Western European governments in NATO, are at the face. They're incredibly unpopular, and they either have lost elections or they're about to lose elections, including here in the United States. So the calculation again becomes what's better for us. The risk of us losing the election is worse than us getting into a nuclear war. I mean, that's how these people think. The Russians, thankfully, don't think that way. So, I mean, it's possible the Russians could expand and hit targets in Western Ukraine that are logistics based, where you have Western, NATO contractors, where you may have some NATO officers who come in and out. The level of military presence by the West in Ukraine is pretty minimal. but there are a large number of contractors. And we also do know, I should qualify to say that we do know that there are Western military personnel there because they are helping the Ukrainians in a number of ways, such as firing Storm Shadow missiles that from the British have, right? I'm assuming it's the same for the French. The French have been very clear about wanting to send more troops so what happens if these troops are killed, right? And then the idea of then expanding that, of then having even more troops. So when I say minimal, you're talking about probably less than 1,000 NATO forces total in Ukraine. Well, if that expands to 5,000 or 10,000, you've got a lot more opportunity for NATO forces to be killed. So, I mean, you just have the risks here of what next. And you've seen with this calculation by the West, by the Western political leaders, that escalation is better politically for them than peace. So what happens when 10 French soldiers get killed by a Russian bomb? I mean, like that kind of thing. What's the French calculation going to be? You've already seen how they've acted before. You've already seen the calculations they've made that escalation is better than peace. What's going to be their response? But what we're really up against as well, and I know there's a lot going on here. What we're really up against as well is what the Russians have said very clearly. Foreign weapons have killed our people on our land. You have dead children laying on a beach in Russia. Uh, those children were killed by American supplied weapons. We all knew this was coming. This is a point that none of us wanted to get to. We've spoken about this over and over and over again. Lots of people have spoken about this and warned about this, and now here we are. And so, what can the Russian response be? And this is where it starts to get dangerous because, where I said before about we're hoping that the Russians have the intelligence, the wisdom, the maturity not to do something that dangerously escalates the war or puts it to a point where it gets on its own path. It's on an automatic glide path, essentially, and the war, because the escalation becomes uncontrollable. There's no brakes that can be applied to it. Well, the Russians have politics as well. The Russians are not immune to the same type of political pressures that in the West, right? I mean, so the idea that is destroying some bridges in Ukraine going to be enough to make up for these dead children on a beach, right? So is that the pressure that the Russian government, that Vladimir Putin and his people will be under, that you're not doing enough? Remember, about a year ago, the Russians had a mutiny. You had the head of Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner forces, leading this mutiny. Putting his men on the road and marching towards Moscow. And what was the chief argument? He was concerned about corruption, but more so is about we weren't fighting hard enough. And you have a whole host of people, both in and out of power in Russia, who believe that with their heart and soul, we're not fighting hard enough. Putin is not fighting hard enough. And so now you have dead children on a beach in Russia, and you're going to take out some bridges. You're going to destroy a logistics base. Maybe you're going to bomb some airfields harder. You're going to shoot down a drone, whatever the different options are. Is that going to be enough to satiate that demand for a response to those dead Russian children laying on a beach? And so we are, Nima, we are in this position that we never wanted to get into. But this is, I've been talking for how long? And this is what we always keep talking about. And everyone else who comes on with you, all the other really smart, great, terrific folks you have coming on. This is where don't get to this point. If you send these ATACMS, if you allow this to occur, this is what's going to happen next. And it took all of what they essentially started using the ATACMS in April. So it took 2 months for us to kill Russian children with our weapons, and now here we are.
Yeah. The problem is whenever we talk about Russia, it seems that Russia means Putin. We know that from that mutiny from Prigozhin, we know that Russia is not Putin. Yeah. There are a lot of people to the right side of Putin who are much more aggressive. They want to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine tomorrow. With whatever they have. But he's trying to, even after all these problems, he's trying to negotiate.
Yeah.
But nobody seems to care what they're doing.
It's farcical. It's like we're watching this satire in American media and as well, Western European media, where it's like a Monty Python skit or something that's occurring where something is so apparent and it's just being ignored. And you had Russian attempts to negotiate prior to their invasion in 2022. You had Russian attempts to negotiate throughout 2023. We've seen Russian attempts to negotiate this year, and every time Russian leadership speaks on this, they indicate their interest in negotiations. It's phrased differently, and some like Medvedev you may anyway, regardless of that. But yeah, it is. It's you're sitting here in the West. I'm sitting here in the U.S. thinking, am I on crazy pills? How is it that you have reportage coming from Reuters or coming from the New York Times, coming from the Wall Street Journal, detailing how clear Russian attempts to negotiate have been, and even say in the case of the Journal at Times, where they've tried to spin it to make it seem as if somehow these Russian attempts at negotiations were nefarious. It's so laughable, those attempts, that people see right through it. And so the point where you have the chief handmaidens, the chief water carriers for the American empire, outlets like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, where nothing they can do can hide the fact that the reality is the Russians have been negotiating the entire time, that this Russian invasion, this occupation of Eastern Ukraine, this war has all been an attempt to force negotiations to attain Ukrainian neutrality. That's it. They themselves, even those who have been the chief proponents of this war, whether it be Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, or again, outlets like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, have said clearly that everything else is window dressing. What matters is neutrality. This is what the Russians want. And you even have, in outlets like Foreign Affairs, which is the mouthpiece for the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the preeminent think tank of the American empire, essentially. So within their own publication, they had a large essay 2-3 months ago on what the April 2022 Istanbul agreement between Ukraine and Russia looked like. Interestingly, the New York Times just published that draft agreement in full just a couple of weeks ago. But even in foreign affairs, which is one of the most hawkish proponents of the American empire you can find. Even in their mouthpiece, even in their propaganda rag, if you will, you see that they have to state that, yes, the issue here is Ukrainian neutrality. That's what matters. And in the foreign affairs piece, they couldn't even dismiss it because they had to reference the fact that this Ukrainian neutrality was built upon or was modeled upon the very successful Austrian neutrality of the Cold War. So it's not even as if this idea of Ukrainian neutrality is something that is made up, is just something that is just, there's no possibility of it working, because it's modeled after something that worked for decades and worked very well for decades. And so that's what you're seeing, is that all the lies stopped making sense a while ago. And now there are very few lies that you can still put up that will stand on their own without falling down right away. And one of them is this lie that the Russians don't want to negotiate. And I think you're starting to get away from that in the American rhetoric. I don't hear that from American officials anymore because they can no longer lie. That was the excuse for a couple of years. We can't talk to the Russians because they won't talk to us. And that's been shown to be untrue. And so now they move into other reasons why they can't negotiate, why the timing's not right. One of their favorite ones, of course, is that this is a Ukrainian decision. It's all solely up to the Ukrainians whether they negotiate or not, as if the $175 billion the United States Congress has appropriated for Ukraine over the last 2 years doesn't have an impact or has no leverage or has no point in any of all this. But it is. I think the lies just don't make sense anymore. And I think this White House really just hopes to get through November. What they'll do, the problem being is that the Russians are, when you miss out, when somebody comes to you and tries to make peace, and I saw this firsthand in Afghanistan, when somebody comes to you and tries to make peace, which is what the Taliban were trying to do for years, up until 2012, essentially, the Taliban were attempting to make peace all through the time during the American occupation. I saw this firsthand. Twice I had dealt with Taliban who came in to us in 2009 to speak about negotiations. And we were told, no, it's that you send it up to the embassy and you're told, nope, we have nothing to do with that. You're not touching that, you know? And then, of course, what you hear from the American narrative is that we have to surge the war. We have to escalate the war in Afghanistan because the Taliban won't negotiate, which is a complete lie. But what happens when your enemy comes to you and they say, look, we want to talk this out. We want to negotiate. And you say, no, we're going to beat you on the battlefield. And to make matters worse, to stick your finger in the wound, you turn around and lie about them and say that they have no interest in peace. This is why we have to defeat them on the battlefield. And then what happens when you don't win, right? What happens when you lose? Well, it looks like Afghanistan. Well, it looks like Ukraine. So wherein you could have had 2 years ago, a year ago, possibly even beginning of this year, maybe. I doubt it, but possibly you could have had a negotiated settlement where Russia pulls out of the Donbass, pulls out of eastern Ukraine. They still keep Crimea, but they pull out of eastern Ukraine. You could have had that. And now you're at the point now where the Russians say, oh, nope, that's over and done with. That's been overcome by events, right? I mean, things have changed. And these provinces, these oblasts, are a part of Russia. They are Russian territory. We've annexed them. They belong to us. They can't go back. They can't go anywhere. And so now you're looking at the settlement that you can have is one that is a terrible settlement for the Ukrainians, for the West, for whoever, right? It's a settlement that the Russians didn't even want to begin with. But you've now put yourself in this position where you've made a terrible settlement the only settlement you can get. And that's if you're willing to do it. And as you were saying, Nima, there are plenty of those in Russia who don't want to settle, who want to win this thing militarily. I don't think the Russians have the capability to do that. I don't think they have the army and the wherewithal to conquer all of Ukraine, and they'd be absolutely nuts if they chose to do that. But, you know, you have many in Russia who do want to do that. That's what they want. They want a military victory. And the fact that they've been rebuffed over and over again. And what you do is that those within Russia, in the various camps within the Russian government or outside the Russian government, those who are arguing for negotiations, you've diminished them. This is like what we did to the Taliban. There are those in the Taliban who are arguing for negotiations. That's why they kept coming in and trying to talk to us. That's why they kept communicating it. That's why, you know, from 2001 through 2012, all throughout Middle Eastern, South Asian, Central Asian newspapers, you'd see this. You'd see it in the New York Times as well. Reports of the Taliban wanting to negotiate, right? Well, you know, when those people get diminished because the other side won't negotiate, and then you are winning militarily, well, the hardliners, those who want military victory, where do you think they're sitting at the table, right? Who do you think is driving the policy? You know what I mean? So the hardliners in Russia, the ones who are advocating for complete military victory, they're the ones who've been proving right because of the U.S. and NATO's actions, right? The U.S. and NATO refused to negotiate, proved the hardliners right, right? The U.S. and NATO pulled Ukraine out of negotiations in 2022, proved the hardliners right. The U.S. and NATO refused to negotiate all through 2023 and lied about the Russians wanting to negotiate, proved the hardliners right. Look at the battle space. Look at the way the war is going. Look at the way the Russian economy is performing. Look at the allies. Look at the trading partners Russia has around the world. Look at the way the world is being remade. That proved the hardliners right. And so you get to this point where what options does the West have? Because there are no more options with Russia, right? So either you take what you get, which is a terrible settlement, or you continue to fight on and you eventually lose. I mean, so it is. It's all this was predictable. All this is things that you've been saying for quite a while. I've been saying, all the people who come on your program, all the great folks, you know, I read the comments because there are some really incredible folks who write into the comments on this, all the things that people in the comments have been saying. I mean, this was predictable. It was foreseeable. It's understandable, and it's common sense. It makes sense. A lot of times people are trying to extrapolate personal behavior or kind of localized group behavior to nation states. And most of the time that doesn't really work, or a lot of time doesn't work, particularly say when like people like try and extrapolate, well, the federal budget's like a household budget. It's nothing at all like a household budget, right? But in sometimes it is like that. Sometimes the analogies do work. And this is one of those things where you could see in terms of your own personal relationships, if you behave this way in any disputes and any type of relationships, what would the consequences be? And this is what we're seeing. So now here in the West, we are dealing with the consequences of reckless, foolish, greedy, stupid decisions by our leadership, decisions that are all based on megalomania and greed. I was pleased to see Lindsey Graham a couple weeks ago showing off that greed, talking about the mineral wealth of Ukraine. I have no idea how true that is or not, but at least it showed how this war is just basically propelled by just a couple things: megalomania, whether it pertains to empire or pertains to domestic politics, and commercial greed, whether it's about liquid natural gas, whether it's about trade rights, whether it's about trade agreements, whether it's about minerals. But now here we are in this spot, and my God, what's going to happen next?
Yeah. But how do you see the conflict right now in Gaza? We've learned that first, Netanyahu said that we're gonna fight Hezbollah, and the Biden administration said we are all out to help them, whatever it takes. And after that, they decided to say to the Netanyahu administration, no, we're not going to support you if you want to fight Hezbollah. And how do they change this mindset? How does it work in your opinion? They suddenly decided to not help them in terms of fighting Hezbollah, and what's going on right now between the Netanyahu administration and the Biden administration?
That's a good question. You have brinksmanship between the White House and the Prime Minister's office in Israel, and it's essentially who's in control of American politics. And Netanyahu is showing that he is more in control of American politics than the American president is. This is what the Israelis have been banking on. Excuse me. This is what the Israelis have been banking on for the last 9 months. What they've been banking on essentially for the last several decades, really going back until say 73, maybe 67. This idea that actually that's not true, because you go back into the formation of Israel, you read about how the Americans pressured the nascent United Nations members to create Israel, right? You see all the pressure that the Americans brought on the rest of the world to allow Israel to happen back in 48. You see it's always been like this. This who's more in control of American politics. And so what you have is Netanyahu going to battle with the American president and betting that the weight of the American lobby, its ability to control American politics, just like all kinds of other special interest groups in the US are able to control American politics because of the nature of the American political system, one essentially of a bribery scheme, legalized bribery scheme that allows Israel, again, like other special interests across the board, to control American politics in a way that binds the hands of the president of the United States. And you're talking about, too, a president of the United States who describes himself as the biggest Zionist in Washington, D.C. Joe Biden is a believer in the greater Israel project. He wants to see it done in a way that doesn't embarrass the United States. He doesn't want to see it done in an untoward way. He wants to see it done in a way that doesn't blemish American foreign policy or the American empire. But he does, if the Israelis could figure out a way to peacefully, quietly annex the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Joe Biden would support it. You certainly saw that happen where under the Trump administration, they annexed the Golan Heights. The Biden administration did nothing about that. Under the Trump administration, Israelis moved the embassy from the Americans moved their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Joe Biden, his administration didn't move it back. So if there is some way that the Israelis could annex, say, East Jerusalem or the West Bank and do it in a way that wasn't so off-putting or wasn't like, 15,000 dead children, they would be all for it. And it's not as if this White House, the Democrats are that against 15,000 dead children. They just don't want it to be politically inconvenient. They don't want it to be politically uncomfortable. They don't want their president to, every time he shows up someplace, he's got people protesting him, which thank God for each and every person who disrupts the president of the United States now and for the next 5 months. God bless them all, because that's what he deserves. And he deserves to go to his grave having people protest him for what he's done in this. However, this brinksmanship, though, between Netanyahu and Biden is really interesting. I mean, it's fascinating. And if it wasn't done on the back of 15,000 dead children, it would be entertaining. It'd be something that you need someone like Gore Vidal to put to life in terms of a fictional story. But, I mean, with Hezbollah and the idea that the Americans won't come to support Israel, I think the Israelis, just like everything else we've seen, they are banking that the Americans will come, that the weight of the Israeli lobby will be such on the American Congress, on the American president, that the control of American media by the Israel lobby, the fact that so many, both within American politics and the American media, are Israeli believers anyway. They believe in Israel first policy. They believe in the primacy of Israel, right? That they are regardless of the money involved, regardless of the lobbying and the pressure, that these are people believe this anyway. That when it comes down to it, when Hezbollah hits and kills Israelis in Jaffa or Haifa, that the Americans will respond, that there will be some type of red line for the Americans, that if Hezbollah crosses it, U.S. aircraft will attack Hezbollah positions. I am quite certain that that is what the Israelis are banking upon. Will that come to pass? I mean, certainly the Americans are saying the Israelis are going to invade Lebanon sometime in July. We've kind of heard that before, I feel. I feel like we've heard that before these last 9 months. There's warnings. If that's true, then I think if it gets to the point where Hezbollah does carry out the attacks on Israel that they say they're going to carry out, supposedly Hezbollah has hundreds of thousands of missiles and rockets, drones, that if they do and they start killing scores of Israelis, if they wreck the Israeli economy any further, that the American military will get involved in terms of launching strikes on Hezbollah positions. So I think that's what the Israelis are banking on, that they have gotten this far with the support of the Americans. Why will that support not extend, particularly if you have a compliant American media and willing American politicians who are going to make the case for American military involvement? So when you have CNN and Fox and MSNBC showing photos of a destroyed Israeli kindergarten that was hit by a Hezbollah drone or whatever, and you have Democrats and Republicans in Congress lining up to say we have to do something about this, we have to defend the only democracy in the Middle East, right? And then, of course, the whole history of America's role in the Middle East, these last, particularly say 40 years or so. And of course, I was in the Marine Corps, so the idea of the 243 Marines and sailors killed in 1983 in Beirut, that will be resurrected. This is a fight we have been in for decades. That type of that narrative will be released. And it will become such a thing that the United States will become involved. And again, that is what I think the Israelis are banking upon. And I think American politicians or the White House is ambivalent on it. I think you have those who understand that this would be a terrible thing to happen, that this is only going to whatever fragile stability we have in the Middle East right now, this completely blows it out of the water. This only further ties the United States into Israel, ties United States, plugs United States even further into Fortress Israel. It isolates the United States even more, only hastens and makes more rapid the decline of the American empire, the rise of other alternatives, right? I mean, it's bad on so many levels, let alone the human level, the tragedy and the suffering that will come from this. So yeah, I think there are those who see that in Washington, but they also understand the politics, and again, the politics will drive it.
Yeah. The United States was offering a defense treaty to Saudi Arabia in order to normalizing the relationship with Israel. But it doesn't seem that it's coming, that it's going to happen. As the crown prince of Saudi Arabia was talking about, the way that he was talking, we haven't seen since this conflict started. He
Yeah.
was literally saying that we have to hold Netanyahu accountable for what he's doing right now in Gaza. Israel is dependent on these Muslim countries, on Azerbaijan, Turkey, these countries. Do they not care about their future? And what would be their future without having a peace plan?
First, let me go back to this peace deal, this normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and then the parallel American-Saudi defense agreement. And this comes off of the quote success unquote of the Trump administration's Abraham Accords. And so what the Biden administration needs is something that's going to, pun intended, quote, trump those Abraham Accords, right? As well as too, the fact that the Trump administration allowed Israel to take the Golan Heights. They moved the embassy to Jerusalem. What is the Biden administration going to do to make sure it has the same degree of favor from the pro-Israel donors who are massive in the U.S.? Estimates are they account for a plurality of Democratic Party donors. I mean, like when you look at it, you say this can't be accurate, and it supposedly is. What can we do, the Biden administration, that will, again, pun intended, trump what the Trump administration did? What can we do to make us better allies of Israel than Trump and his people were? And I think getting this crown jewel, Saudi Arabia, it also tied into the obsession that we have here in the United States, in Washington, D.C., with Iran. Oh, man, we are going to now have a deal that really, and if Iran ever tries anything, including if they're proxies in Yemen, the Houthis, Ansar al-Salah, ever again fire a drone and hit their Aramco oil facilities, that will give us reason to go after Iran, like that kind of thing. So that machination was all there as well. But this obsession with this Saudi deal, and it becomes personal, and you see this in terms of how important individuals can be. There's the great debate, right, whether or not individuals create history, or whether it's like the concept that individuals, history is of its own making. You get into the whole like Tolstoy's general type of thing. But I think you can, and I think both are correct, but I think you can, in a sense, sometimes see particular individuals. In this case, say someone like Brett McGurk, who has been in every administration. I knew Brett McGurk 20 years ago in Baghdad. Who has been in every administration for the last 2 decades, involved in this American catastrophe, these American crimes in the Middle East. Brett McGurk has been at the center of it. And McGurk is obsessed with this Saudi deal. And so when you have that guy as kind of head of your Middle East plans, he's not even, I forget what his title is, but he's kind of a special advisor, but he's kind of the one who drives so much American Middle East policy. And when you got him pushing this thing, when this is his bone, he's not going to give it up. You could see how individuals have to matter, particularly when the argument can be made of how good this is for American politics. Well, this will be what to our Israeli donors proves us as at least as good as the Trump administration. And then for all your Iran hawks who dominate the American foreign policy establishment, this is a good thing. And then you have those out there who are saying, we need to keep the Chinese out. So, okay, we're going to lock arms with the Saudis. And we're going to give them what they want. Oh, they want nuclear technology? The same people who, as we keep seeing more and more being revealed, the same government that was involved in the 9/11 attacks, yeah, we're going to give them nuclear technology. No problem, right? I mean, like, so you see all this on so many levels, and you say, again, am I taking crazy pills here? But I mean, the idea that this is a bone that the Americans won't drop, and that they see it. So and now the Saudis, I think, have options. Certainly the Chinese, the Russians, you have this idea of Saudi Arabia joining BRICS. You have this idea of the whole world shifting away, getting out from underneath the American empire. And the Saudis will be in the vanguard of that. The Saudis, I think, have been forward looking for a number of years. They've certainly had ideas about where do they go post oil, those kinds of things. And that perspective, that forward thinking, and don't anyone get me wrong that I'm a fan of the Saudi government by any means, but this idea that they're forward thinking is something that is completely lost on the Americans. So where are the Saudis? What's the Saudis think that they're going to get out of this? And now that they see too that, well, we're coupling this with what's happening in Palestine. There's no agreement without a Palestinian state. Well, that gives them the role that they want in the Middle East. So you see these various countries, these leaders, whether it's Erdogan in Turkey, whether it's MBS in Saudi Arabia. I don't think Sisi would ever come to pass for him, but who's going to be the next Salah ad-Din, right? Who's going to unite the Middle East? And I think they do have these thoughts in their heads. And this is a way that we can be the ones who are in the vanguard, that we are the ones who are leading, who are defending, who are doing the most for the Palestinians. Now they're doing F all. They're doing nothing for the Palestinians. This is all about trying to ensure that in some type of hierarchy they have in their heads of the region that they are at the top. They couldn't care less about the Palestinians. But you get this idea then about these other nations and what does that mean for stability? And that's the argument that they make, that the Americans will make for this deal, is that bringing the Israelis and the Saudis together increase stability. When you can see right through that, and you see that one of the whole purposes of this ploy is to make it so that it's more likely that that somehow they feel that Iran is further isolated, but it makes it more likely for a war against Iran to happen, because you now have these types of alliances. You now have these relationships that allow for war to happen so easily. So the whole deal, we examine this from top to bottom, is just rotten, corrupted, and just foolish on so many levels. But again, you go back and you look at the reasons why the Americans want it so badly, and you can see why the Saudis, they can get a lot out of this, right? We're going to get the American military tied to us. They're going to give us nuclear technology, right? I mean, like all types of, and those the Saudis who are against rapprochement with Iran, here's just a huge boon for us, right? And this elevates us to the top because we're the ones who got the Americans to force Israel to accept the idea of a Palestinian state. You can see why the Saudis want this. And it's as easy as you can see how stupid the Americans are for wanting it.